Prince Alexander had always gotten everything he wanted. At just 16 years old, he lived in a massive palace with golden walls and servants who followed his every command. His father, King William, ruled the kingdom of Valdoria with wisdom and respect, but Alexander had never learned these qualities. Instead, he spent his days playing video games, eating expensive food, and making fun of anyone he thought was beneath him. On this particular sunny morning, Alexander was bored. He had already broken 3 expensive vases while playing indoor football, made the kitchen staff remake his breakfast 4 times, and gotten his private tutor fired for giving him homework. The young prince wandered through the palace halls, his designer shoes clicking loudly on the marble floors as he searched for something entertaining to do. "I'm so bored," he complained loudly to no one in particular. "There's nothing fun in this stupid palace." The servants nearby pretended not to hear him, knowing that any response might lead to more trouble. Alexander had a reputation for being cruel to the staff, often making them clean up messes he created on purpose, or forcing them to do ridiculous tasks for his amusement. As he walked past the grand windows overlooking the palace courtyard, something caught his attention. Below, he could see people gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Tourists from around the world came to watch this traditional event, where the royal guards would march in perfect formation and perform their ancient ritual. Alexander had seen the ceremony countless times, but today he had a different idea. "Those guards think they're so important," he muttered, pressing his face against the cool glass. "Standing there all serious and fancy. I bet I could make them break their stupid rules." A wicked smile spread across his face as he imagined the chaos he could cause. The guards were famous for never moving or speaking during their duty, no matter what happened around them. They were trained to remain perfectly still like living statues. Alexander quickly ran to his room and grabbed his phone, making sure the camera was ready. He had over 2 million followers on social media who loved watching his pranks and stunts. Most of them thought he was hilarious, though they didn't know how mean he could be in real life. Today, he planned to create content that would get millions of views and make him even more famous. The prince changed into casual clothes and snuck out of the palace through a side entrance that most people didn't know about. He had used this route many times before when he wanted to cause trouble without his parents knowing. The morning air was crisp and fresh, and the courtyard was already filling with excited tourists taking pictures and waiting for the ceremony to begin. Alexander positioned himself near the main guard post, where the most senior guard always stood. This guard was known throughout the kingdom for his perfect record and unwavering dedication. He had served the royal family for over 20 years and had never once broken protocol. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his boots shined to mirror perfection, and his expression remained completely neutral no matter what chaos happened around him. "This is going to be epic," Alexander whispered to himself, starting his phone recording. He had no idea that this decision would change his life forever. The young prince was about to learn that some people deserved respect, regardless of what he thought about their position. He was also about to discover that actions have consequences, even for someone who had never faced them before. The crowd around him grew larger as more tourists arrived, all eager to witness the famous ceremony. Children pointed excitedly at the guards' parents, took family photos, and tour guides explained the history and significance of the tradition. Alexander felt a surge of confidence as he realized how many people would witness his prank. In his mind, this would be the perfect way to show everyone how boring and pointless he thought the whole ceremony was. Little did he know that among the crowd stood several people who would recognize him despite his casual clothes. More importantly, he had no idea that his target, the senior guard, was not just any ordinary soldier. This man had a story that would soon make Alexander question everything he thought he knew about respect, duty, and what it truly meant to serve others. The ceremony was about to begin when Alexander spotted his perfect target. Guard Captain Marcus Thompson stood at the main post, his tall frame perfectly straight and his eyes focused ahead. His dark blue uniform displayed numerous medals and ribbons that told the story of his distinguished service. Marcus had short gray hair and a weathered face that showed years of dedication and hard work. Alexander didn't know anything about Marcus's background. He didn't know that Marcus had grown up in poverty, working 3 jobs as a teenager to help his sick mother pay for medicine. He had no idea that Marcus had earned every one of those medals through acts of genuine bravery, including saving a family from a burning building and stopping a terrorist attack at the palace gates 5 years earlier. To Alexander, Marcus was just another boring guard who took his job too seriously. "Perfect," Alexander muttered, making sure his phone was recording as he approached Marcus. The guard stood completely motionless, his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed on the horizon. Tourists walked around him taking selfies and admiring his perfect posture, but Marcus never acknowledged them. This was exactly what Alexander wanted to challenge. Alexander started small, walking very close to Marcus and making faces at him. When that didn't work, he began speaking loudly about how stupid he thought the guards looked. "Look at this guy," he said to his phone camera, "standing here like a robot. I bet he doesn't even have a brain in there." Some tourists nearby looked uncomfortable, but Alexander was just getting started. The young prince then decided to escalate his prank. He pulled out a $20 bill and waved it in front of Marcus's face, trying to get him to look down. "Hey, guard man, want some money? You probably don't make very much standing around all day doing nothing," Alexander taunted. Marcus remained perfectly still, his breathing steady and his expression unchanged. This only made Alexander more determined to get a reaction. Next, Alexander began dancing around Marcus in circles, making loud noises and singing off-key songs. He thought he was being hilarious, and his phone camera captured every moment. A few tourists laughed nervously, but others began to look disapproving. One elderly woman shook her head and walked away, clearly disgusted by the display of disrespect. "Come on, statue man," Alexander called out, getting more frustrated by Marcus's complete lack of response. "Don't you have anything to say? Are you even alive in there?" He began poking Marcus's arm, testing to see if he could make the guard move even slightly. Marcus's training kicked in and he remained absolutely motionless despite the physical contact. Growing more desperate for a reaction, Alexander decided to try something that he thought would surely break Marcus's concentration. He began telling made-up stories about the guard, speaking loudly enough for everyone around to hear. "This guy probably lives in his mom's basement," he announced. "I bet he's never even kissed a girl. Look at him, so serious about his little toy soldier job." The crowd around them was growing larger, but the atmosphere was changing. What had started as mild amusement was turning into discomfort and disapproval. Parents began pulling their children away, not wanting them to witness such disrespectful behavior. Several people in the crowd recognized Alexander despite his casual clothes, and whispers began spreading through the group. "Isn't that the prince?" One person whispered to another. "What is he doing?" The question rippled through the crowd as more people realized who was causing the disturbance. Some pulled out their own phones to record, but not because they found it entertaining. They were documenting behavior that they found shocking and inappropriate. Alexander was completely oblivious to the changing mood around him. He was so focused on trying to break Marcus's composure that he didn't notice the disapproving stares or hear the concerned whispers. In his mind, he was creating the perfect viral video that would make him famous and prove how silly he thought the royal traditions were. But Marcus continued to stand perfectly still, his training and professionalism overwhelming any personal feelings he might have had about the situation. He had dealt with difficult situations before, though none quite like this. His years of service had taught him that dignity and duty were more important than responding to provocation, no matter how personal or insulting it became. As Alexander prepared for his next, more extreme attempt to humiliate the guard, he had no idea that several important people were now watching from the palace windows above. His behavior was about to attract attention that would change everything, and the consequences would be far more serious than he could ever imagine. Alexander's frustration grew with each passing minute as Marcus remained completely unmoved by his antics. The prince had expected to break the guard's composure within seconds, but 15 minutes had passed and Marcus stood like an unshakable mountain. This only made Alexander more determined to escalate his behavior to dangerous new levels. "Fine," Alexander muttered to his camera. "If you won't react to words, let's try something else." He walked to a nearby fountain and filled his expensive water bottle, returning with a mischievous grin that made several onlookers step back nervously. The crowd had grown considerably, but now many people looked worried rather than entertained. Without warning, Alexander splashed the water directly onto Marcus's perfectly polished boots. The cold water soaked through the leather and into Marcus's socks, but the guard didn't move even a millimeter. His training had prepared him for weather, discomfort, and unexpected situations, and he treated this as just another test of his professionalism. Still nothing? Alexander laughed, though his laughter sounded forced and slightly desperate. Let's see how you handle this. He began throwing small pieces of gravel from the courtyard decorations at Marcus's uniform, trying to hit the shiny metals on his chest. Each piece bounced off harmlessly, but the disrespect of the action made many tourists gasp in shock. An elderly man in the crowd finally spoke up. "Young man, that's enough. Show some respect." But Alexander just rolled his eyes and continued his assault on Marcus's dignity. He had never been told no by anyone, and he wasn't about to start listening to strangers now. The situation took a darker turn when Alexander decided to involve other people in his prank. He began encouraging tourists to join him, offering to pay them if they would help him try to make the guard move. "Come on, everyone," he called out loudly. "Let's see what it takes to break this robot. I'll give $50 to anyone who can make him flinch." Most people ignored him or walked away in disgust, but a few teenagers, not recognizing the prince and thinking it was just harmless fun, began to participate. They started making loud noises and silly gestures around Marcus, turning what had been a solo prank into a group harassment session. This was exactly what Alexander wanted. He felt powerful and in control, believing he was creating the ultimate viral video. His phone captured every moment as he orchestrated what he thought was hilarious chaos around the stoic guard. In his mind, he was proving that the royal traditions were outdated and ridiculous. But then Alexander made a crucial mistake that would change everything. In his excitement to create more dramatic content, he stepped directly in front of Marcus and began blocking the guard's view of the ceremonial grounds. This wasn't just disrespectful anymore. It was interfering with an official royal duty. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," Alexander demanded, now standing just inches from Marcus's face. The guard's eyes remained focused straight ahead, looking right through Alexander as if he wasn't there. This made the prince even angrier, and he began waving his hands directly in front of Marcus's eyes. Unknown to Alexander, his behavior had attracted the attention of several very important people. From her office window high above, Queen Isabella had been watching the entire scene unfold with growing horror and disbelief. Her son's behavior was being witnessed by hundreds of people, including foreign dignitaries who were visiting the palace for important diplomatic meetings. In another window, King William stood with his advisors, his face red with anger and embarrassment. The king had spent years building relationships with other nations and working to maintain the dignity of the royal family. Now his own son was destroying that reputation in front of cameras that were broadcasting around the world. But the most important observer was someone Alexander had never seen before. Standing quietly at the edge of the crowd was General Patricia Hayes, the highest-ranking military officer in the kingdom and Marcus's direct superior. She had come to personally observe the ceremony as part of a routine inspection, but instead found herself witnessing an unprecedented breach of protocol. General Hayes watched as Alexander continued to harass her best soldier, a man she knew personally and respected deeply. She knew Marcus's story, his sacrifices, and his unwavering dedication to duty. What she was seeing made her blood boil, but she remained calm and professional, carefully documenting everything for the report she would soon have to write. As Alexander prepared for what he planned to be his grand finale, completely unaware of the powerful people now watching him, he had no idea that his next actions would trigger consequences he never could have imagined. The spoiled prince was about to learn that some lines should never be crossed, especially when cameras are rolling and the whole world is watching. Alexander decided it was time for his grand finale. Nothing he had done so far had made Marcus move even slightly, and his social media followers were commenting that they wanted to see something more dramatic. The prince read through the live comments on his phone, seeing suggestions that made him grin wickedly. "All right, statue man," Alexander announced loudly. "Time for the ultimate test." He walked over to a nearby trash bin and grabbed a handful of banana peels and food scraps that tourists had thrown away. The crowd watched in stunned silence as he returned to Marcus with the disgusting mess in his hands. "Let's see how professional you are when things get really messy." Alexander laughed, raising his hand to throw the garbage at Marcus's pristine uniform. But just as he was about to release the trash, something unexpected happened that made him freeze in place. A small child no more than 7 years old broke away from her parents and ran directly toward Marcus. She had been watching the entire scene with growing distress, and her innocent mind couldn't understand why someone would be so mean to the nice guard. Before anyone could stop her, she positioned herself protectively in front of Marcus. "Stop being mean to him," the little girl shouted at Alexander, her voice brave despite tears streaming down her face. "He's just doing his job. My daddy says guards keep us safe." The child's pure courage and moral clarity cut through the crowd's shock like a knife, and suddenly everyone was looking at Alexander with new eyes. For a moment, even Alexander hesitated. The image of a small child defending an adult from his cruelty was not the viral content he had planned. But his pride and stubbornness quickly took over, and he made the worst decision of his young life. "Get out of my way, kid," he said harshly, gently pushing the child aside. "This doesn't concern you." The crowd gasped as Alexander proceeded with his plan, throwing the garbage directly at Marcus's chest. Pieces of rotten food and sticky residue splattered across the guard's medals and uniform, creating a disgusting mess that dripped onto the ground. Even after this ultimate humiliation, Marcus didn't move. His training and professionalism held firm, though those who looked closely could see a slight tightening around his eyes. The guard had endured many hardships in his life, but being publicly degraded while unable to defend himself tested every fiber of his self-control. Alexander stood back, filming Marcus covered in garbage, laughing hysterically at what he thought was his greatest prank ever. "Look at him," he shouted to his camera, still standing there like nothing happened. What a pathetic robot. He was so caught up in his own cruel enjoyment that he didn't notice the dramatic change in the crowd around him. The tourists were no longer watching with amusement or even discomfort. They were staring at Alexander with genuine disgust and anger. Parents covered their children's eyes. Elderly visitors shook their heads in dismay, and several people began loudly expressing their disapproval. "That's absolutely disgusting," one woman said clearly. "What kind of person does that to someone who can't fight back?" Her words sparked others to speak up, and suddenly Alexander found himself surrounded by a crowd of angry voices criticizing his behavior. But the real consequences were just beginning. From her position at the edge of the crowd, General Hayes stepped forward, her military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. She walked directly to Marcus, pulled out a clean handkerchief, and began gently cleaning the garbage from his uniform while speaking quietly to him. "Stand down, Captain Thompson," she said in a voice only he could hear. "Your duty here is complete, and you've performed it with exceptional honor." Marcus finally allowed himself to move, accepting the general's assistance while maintaining his dignity, despite the humiliation he had just endured. The crowd watched this interaction with growing understanding. It became clear that the guard Alexander had been tormenting wasn't just any soldier, but someone of significant importance and respect. The general's presence and obvious concern for Marcus made Alexander's behavior look even more shameful by comparison. Alexander finally began to sense that something had gone wrong with his plan. The crowd was no longer laughing or engaging with his content. Instead, they were looking at him with expressions he had never seen before. For the first time in his privileged life, Alexander was facing genuine social consequences for his actions. "What's everyone staring at?" he asked defensively. Though his voice had lost its earlier confidence, he looked around at the sea of disapproving faces, suddenly feeling very small and very alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. The reality of what he had done was starting to sink in, but the full consequences were still to come. General Hayes finished helping Marcus clean his uniform, and then turned her attention to Alexander. Her steel-gray eyes fixed on the young prince with an intensity that made him step backward instinctively. The crowd had grown completely silent, sensing that something important was about to happen. "Young man," the general said in a voice that commanded immediate attention, "do you have any idea who you just humiliated?" Her question wasn't loud, but it carried across the courtyard with the authority of someone who had spent decades leading soldiers into battle. Alexander tried to regain his cocky attitude, though his voice wavered slightly. "Just some guard who takes himself too seriously," he replied, holding up his phone. "I was making content for my followers. It's not a big deal." The general's expression grew even more stern. "Not a big deal?" she repeated slowly. "Let me tell you exactly who Captain Marcus Thompson is. Since you clearly don't bother to learn about the people you choose to torment, she gestured toward Marcus, who now stood at respectful attention beside her. This man has served your family's kingdom for 23 years. He has risked his life countless times to protect not just the royal family, but ordinary citizens like everyone standing here today. The crowd leaned in closer, eager to hear more about the guard they had just seen treated so poorly. Alexander felt increasingly uncomfortable as the general continued speaking, her words making him realize he might have made a serious mistake. 5 years ago, General Hayes continued, Captain Thompson single-handedly stopped 3 armed terrorists who had breached the palace gates during a state dinner. He was shot twice in the process, but still managed to protect 67 guests, including children and elderly diplomats. He spent 4 months in the hospital recovering from his injuries. Alexander's phone began to feel heavy in his hands as he listened. This wasn't the story he had expected to hear about the man he had just covered in garbage. 3 years ago, Captain Thompson was off duty when he witnessed an apartment building catch fire. Without hesitation, he ran into the burning building 6 times, saving an entire family including 2 infant twins. He suffered severe smoke inhalation and burns on 30% of his body, but refused medical treatment until he was certain everyone was safe. The crowd began murmuring with admiration and respect for Marcus, while their looks toward Alexander grew increasingly hostile. Several people started taking pictures of the prince, but not for the reasons he usually enjoyed attention. General Hayes wasn't finished. Last year, Captain Thompson donated his entire annual salary to help build a school in the poorest district of our capital city. He has been doing this quietly for the past 8 years, never seeking recognition or publicity. That school now educates over 400 children who would otherwise have no access to learning. Alexander felt his stomach drop as he realized the magnitude of what he had done. He had publicly humiliated a genuine hero, someone who had sacrificed repeatedly for others, while Alexander had spent his life taking everything for granted. But perhaps most importantly, the general continued, Captain Thompson is the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to support him after his father died in military service. He grew up in poverty, earned his position through merit and dedication, and has never once complained about the challenges he has faced. The crowd was now openly showing their disgust with Alexander's behavior. Parents pointed him out to their children as an example of how not to behave, and several tourists began posting their own videos online, showing the prince's cruel treatment of such an honorable man. So tell me, young man, General Hayes said, stepping closer to Alexander, exactly what gives you the right to treat a man like this as your personal entertainment? Her question hung in the air like a challenge, and Alexander found himself unable to answer. For the first time in his life, Alexander was experiencing shame. Real deep shame that made his chest feel tight and his face burn with embarrassment. He looked at Marcus, who stood quietly with dignity despite everything that had happened to him, and realized how small and petty his own behavior had been. I didn't know, Alexander stammered, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't a real excuse. Not knowing Marcus's story didn't justify treating any person with such cruelty and disrespect. The general nodded grimly. Ignorance is not an excuse for cruelty, she said, echoing Alexander's own thoughts. And unfortunately for you, your behavior here today has been witnessed by many people, including some who will have very strong opinions about what they have seen. As if summoned by her words, Alexander heard footsteps behind him and turned to see palace security guards approaching. But these weren't coming to protect him. They were coming to escort him back to face the consequences of his actions. Consequences that would prove to be far more serious than he had ever imagined possible. The palace security guards approached Alexander with serious expressions that made it clear this wasn't a friendly escort. Captain Rodriguez, the head of palace security, stepped forward and spoke in a voice that brooked no argument. Prince Alexander, you need to come with us immediately. The king and queen are waiting for you in the throne room. The formal use of his title, rather than the casual address he was used to from palace staff, told Alexander that he was in more trouble than he had ever experienced before. As they walked through the palace corridors, Alexander could feel the eyes of every servant and staff member on him. News of his behavior had already spread throughout the palace, and the disappointed looks on familiar faces made his shame grow deeper with each step. These were people who had served his family loyally for years, and now they had witnessed him disgrace everything the royal family was supposed to represent. The throne room doors opened to reveal both of his parents waiting for him, along with several advisors and officials he recognized as some of the most important people in the kingdom. The formal setting and serious faces made Alexander realize this wasn't going to be a simple scolding that he could charm his way out of. King William stood from his throne, his face showing a mixture of anger and deep disappointment that cut through Alexander like a knife. "Alexander," he began, his voice heavy with emotion, "in 32 years as king, I have never been more ashamed of anyone bearing our family name." Queen Isabella remained seated, but her usually warm eyes were cold and distant as she looked at her son. "We watched everything from the window," she said quietly. "Every cruel word, every heartless action. We saw you humiliate a man who has given everything in service to our family and our people." Alexander tried to speak, but his father held up a hand for silence. "You will listen first," the king commanded. "Do you have any idea what you have done? That video of your behavior is already spreading across the internet. By tomorrow morning, the entire world will have seen the Prince of Valdoria treating a war hero like garbage for entertainment." The advisors began presenting reports that made Alexander's situation clear. His video had already been viewed over 1 million times in just 2 hours, and the comments were overwhelmingly negative. International news organizations were picking up the story, with headlines calling him the cruelest prince and questioning whether he was fit to ever rule the kingdom. "The diplomatic implications are severe," reported the foreign minister. "3 countries have already expressed concerns about future relationships with Valdoria if this represents the character of our future leadership." The Japanese ambassador specifically mentioned that such behavior toward military personnel is completely unacceptable in their culture. But the personal consequences were even more devastating. Alexander learned that Marcus had quietly submitted his resignation from the royal guard, stating that he could no longer serve a family whose heir had publicly degraded him. This news hit Alexander harder than any diplomatic crisis could have. "Marcus Thompson is one of the finest men I have ever known," King William said, his voice breaking slightly. "He has saved lives, sacrificed his own comfort and safety, and served our family with unwavering loyalty. And you drove him away for the sake of a stupid video." Queen Isabella finally stood, walking closer to her son. "Alexander, we failed you as parents by never teaching you the true meaning of responsibility and respect. But you were 16 years old enough to understand the difference between right and wrong. What you did today was not a prank or a mistake. It was deliberate cruelty." The consequences came swiftly and completely. Alexander's social media accounts were immediately suspended pending a full investigation of his online behavior. His credit cards were canceled, his allowance was eliminated, and his private tutors were dismissed. Most importantly, he was removed from all royal duties and public appearances indefinitely. "You will spend the next year working directly with the palace staff," his father announced. "You will clean floors, serve meals, wash dishes, and do every job that you have watched others do, while taking their service for granted. Perhaps by working alongside the people you have looked down on, you will learn something about dignity and respect." But there was one more consequence that Alexander hadn't expected. "You will also write a personal letter of apology to Captain Thompson," his mother added. "And if he agrees to meet with you, you will apologize to him face to face. Whether he forgives you or not is entirely up to him." As the full weight of his situation settled on him, Alexander realized that his comfortable, privileged life was over. He had spent 16 years taking everything for granted, treating people poorly, and believing that his royal status protected him from any real consequences. Now he was facing the reality that actions have results, and some mistakes cannot be easily fixed. The meeting ended with Alexander being escorted to what had previously been a guest room, but would now be his modest living quarters. Gone was his luxurious suite with its gaming systems and expensive furniture. He would live simply while he learned to work for the first time in his life. As he sat alone in his new room, Alexander finally began to understand the true cost of his behavior. He had lost his privileges, damaged his family's reputation, and worst of all, hurt a good man who had never done anything to deserve such treatment. The question now was whether he could find a way to make things right, or if some damage was simply too great to repair. 6 months had passed since that terrible day in the courtyard, and Alexander barely recognized the person he had become. His hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused from months of hard work. He woke up at 5 in the morning every day to help prepare breakfast for the palace staff, spent his afternoons cleaning and maintaining the grounds, and ended each day exhausted, but strangely fulfilled. The palace staff had been skeptical of him at first, expecting the spoiled prince to quit or complain after a few days. Instead, they watched in amazement as Alexander threw himself into every task with determination and humility. He learned the names of every worker, listened to their stories, and gradually began to understand the lives of people he had previously ignored. Mrs. Chen, the head cook who had endured years of Alexander's demanding breakfast tantrums, became his unlikely mentor. "You're not the same boy who used to throw food at my staff," she told him one afternoon as they worked together preparing dinner for 300 people. "That boy was cruel and selfish. This young man is learning what it means to serve others." Alexander had written and rewritten his letter to Marcus dozens of times, never feeling like he could find the right words to express his regret. How do you apologize for public humiliation? How do you explain that you've changed when your actions were so terrible? Finally, he decided that simple honesty was the only approach that might work. The letter he eventually sent was just 2 pages long, but it contained more genuine emotion than anything Alexander had ever written. He didn't make excuses or try to minimize what he had done. Instead, he took full responsibility for his actions and explained how the past 6 months had changed his understanding of respect, dignity, and service. 3 weeks after sending the letter, Alexander received a response that he had been hoping for but hardly dared to expect. Marcus had agreed to meet with him, but only in the palace gardens where Alexander now worked every day, tending the flowers and vegetables that fed the palace staff. On the day of the meeting, Alexander's hands shook as he waited by the rose garden he had been carefully maintaining. When Marcus appeared walking slowly down the garden path, Alexander was struck by how dignified the former guard looked, even in civilian clothes. The medals were gone, but the bearing and character that had made Marcus special were still clearly visible. "Captain Thompson," Alexander said quietly, standing respectfully as Marcus approached. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I don't deserve your time or forgiveness." Marcus studied the young man before him, noting the changes that 6 months of hard work and reflection had brought. The arrogant, cruel boy from the courtyard had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely remorseful and changed. "I've been watching you," Marcus said simply. "The staff tell me you've been working hard, treating people with respect, learning what it means to contribute rather than just take. Mrs. Chen says you're one of her best helpers now." Alexander nodded, fighting back tears that he hadn't expected to feel. "I've learned so much about the people who keep this palace running, about their lives and struggles and dignity. I realize now that what I did to you wasn't just cruel to one person, but an insult to everyone who serves others honorably." They walked together through the gardens that Alexander had been tending, and he pointed out the vegetables he had grown that would feed dozens of families. "This tomato plant was dying when I started working here," he said, touching a leaf gently. "Mrs. Chen taught me how to nurse it back to health. She said that growing things requires patience, care, and respect for life. I think she was teaching me about more than just gardening." Marcus listened as Alexander explained how his perspective had changed, how he had learned to see the palace staff as individuals with their own stories, dreams, and dignity. The prince spoke about Maria, the cleaning lady who was working extra shifts to pay for her daughter's medical school, and Roberto, the maintenance worker who volunteered at a homeless shelter every weekend. "I understand now that what I did to you was unforgivable," Alexander said finally. "You dedicated your life to protecting others, and I treated you like an object for my entertainment. I can't undo that, but I want you to know that I've spent every day since then trying to become someone worthy of your service." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, studying the young man who stood before him with such obvious remorse and growth. Finally, he spoke in the same calm, steady voice that had carried him through years of military service. "Prince Alexander," he said, "I accept your apology. More importantly, I can see that you've learned something valuable from this experience. The person who humiliated me 6 months ago was a child who had never learned the value of respect or hard work. The young man standing here today has the potential to become a leader who truly serves his people. The relief and gratitude in Alexander's eyes were genuine and overwhelming, but Marcus wasn't finished speaking. However, he continued, forgiveness is just the beginning. The real test will be whether you continue on this path when the cameras aren't rolling and people aren't watching. True character is what you do when no one is looking, when it would be easy to go back to your old ways. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made Alexander gasp. It was the medal for valor that he had earned for saving the family from the burning building, the same medal that had been covered in garbage during Alexander's cruel prank. I want you to have this, Marcus said, placing the medal in Alexander's trembling hands. Not because you've earned it, but as a reminder of what service really means. Someday, when you become king, I hope you'll remember that true leadership means putting others before yourself, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and treating every person with the dignity they deserve. Alexander looked down at the medal, feeling its weight not just in his hands but in his heart. He knew that this moment would define the rest of his life, and he was determined to prove worthy of the trust that Marcus was placing in him. The spoiled, cruel prince was gone forever, replaced by someone who finally understood what it meant to serve others with honor and humility.